Hello students, I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the virtual world of business studies. Good afternoon dear students. A warm welcome to a new session on small business and enterprise. This is part 2 of this chapter. Let me move on to the next slide. And this slide is going to focus on entrepreneurship development. Entrepreneurship, as we all understand, is the process of setting up one's own business. The person who sets up the business is called as entrepreneur, and the outcome of the process, which is the business unit itself, is called as enterprise. Now a lot of you would say, sir, where did this word come down from? So the word entrepreneur is derived from the French verb entreprendre, which means to undertake. Let's move on to the next slide. In this slide, we will discuss who is an entrepreneur and who is a businessman. So to begin with, an entrepreneur is more than a businessman. If a businessman brings some innovation to his activities and eyes on value addition to his product or service, he is called as an entrepreneur. A businessman, on the other hand, is engaged in the process of buying and selling goods with the objective of making profit. It is not necessary that the businessman is into innovations, and therefore we say that all entrepreneurs are businessmen, but all businessmen are not entrepreneurs. Let's move on to the next slide and talk in a little detail what is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is the purposeful activity of an individual or a group of associated individuals undertaken to initiate, maintain or organize profit-oriented business units for production or distribution of economic goods and services. Now let's move on to the next slide, and this slide talks about characteristics of entrepreneur. Let's move on to the next slide. So when we look at the characteristics of entrepreneur or entrepreneurship, the first characteristic says systematic activity. Now what do you mean by this? Entrepreneurship is a systematic activity. It is done step by step and it is a purposeful activity. It has certain temperament, skill and other knowledge and competency requirements that can be acquired, learned and developed, both by formal education and vocational training as well. It can also be done by observation and work experience, and therefore we call it as a systematic activity. Let us look at the second characteristic, which says it is lawful and purposeful activity. Now how do we explain this? Entrepreneurship aims to conduct a lawful business. The purpose of entrepreneurship is to create value for personal profit and social gain. It must be noted that one may try to legitimize unlawful actions as entrepreneurship on the grounds that just as entrepreneurship involves risk, so does unlawful business, which is not true. Let's get back to the next word, which talks about innovation and creativity. Entrepreneurship involves a continuous search for new ideas. For a firm, innovation generally means cost saving or revenue enhancing. Entrepreneurship is innovative because it involves introduction of new products, discovery of new markets, and source of supply of inputs. Technological breakthrough as well as introduction of newer organization forms for doing things better, cheaper, faster, and in a manner that causes the least harm to the environment. Now let's talk about the fourth point, which says organizing production. Now, production requires the combined utilization of diverse factors of production, say land, labor, capital, and technology. Entrepreneur mobilizes these resources into a productive enterprise or firm. An entrepreneur may not possess any of these resources, but he may just have the idea that he promotes among the resource provider. Entrepreneur has to convince the financing institutions, and with the capital so arranged, he enters into contract of supply of equipment, material, utilities like water supply, electricity, technology. Organization of production also requires knowledge about availability and location of the resources, as well as the optimum way to combine them. Let's move on to the fifth point, and here we are talking about risk taking. Entrepreneurship involves bigger risk as compared to career in employment or practice of a profession, as there is no assured payoff. The essence of entrepreneurship is the willingness to assume risk arising out of the creation and implementation of new ideas. Now, let's move on to the next slide. And we are going to talk about the Startup India scheme, which is one of the most favorite programs of the Modi government. Let's move on to the next slide. So Startup India scheme is an important initiative by Government of India to promote a strong ecosystem for nurturing innovation and startup, new enterprises in the country. Let's move on to the next slide. So as per the notification of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, what is the definition of startup? So a startup means an entity which is incorporated or registered in India. It is not older than 5 years. The annual turnover does not exceed rupees 25 crores in any preceding year, and it is working towards innovation, development, or commercialization of products or services with the support of technology or intellectual property rights and patents. Now, let's move on to the next slide. And here, I would like to give you some examples of very popular startups in India. The examples could be Paytm, your Flipkart, Snapdeal, Swiggy, Big Basket, Byju's app, Ola Cabs, Make My Trip, ShopClose, Oyo Rooms, Zomato, Redbus, Uber Eats. So these are some of the examples of startups in India. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's begin with the slide. And this slide talks about aims and objectives of startup scheme. So the first one is to develop an entrepreneurial culture. To initiate an entrepreneurial culture and inculcate entrepreneurial values in the society and influence the mindset of people towards entrepreneurship. Let's look at the second point, awareness among the youth. Now, how do you explain? To create awareness about the charms of being an entrepreneur and the process of entrepreneurship, especially among the younger generation. Encourage more dynamic startups. Now, how do we explain this? To encourage more dynamic startups by motivating educated youth, scientists, and technologists to consider entrepreneurship as a lucrative, preferred, and viable career. Now the fourth point says to support the startups in various stages. And how do we explain? To support the early phase of entrepreneurship development, including the pre-startup as well as early post-startup phase and growth enterprise. Let's look on to the fifth point, which is to promote underrepresented target groups. Now, how do we explain? To broad base the entrepreneurial supply by meeting specific needs of underrepresented target groups. Now, who are these? Women, socially and economically backward communities, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, underrepresented regions, to achieve inclusiveness and sustainable development to address the needs of the population at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, let's move on to the next slide. And in this slide, we are going to focus on ways to fund the startups. Now, so let's begin. In addition to the government's plan that offer capital and bank loan to startups, the funding for startups can also be availed in the following ways. Number one, bootstrapping. And let us explain this. Bootstrapping in business means starting a business without external help or capital. It is commonly known as self-financing. It is considered as the first funding option because by using personal saving and resources, entrepreneur is tied to his business. Moreover, investors consider it as a merit at a later stage. However, it is a good option of funding only if the initial requirement is small and handy. Let's go down to the second source, which is called as crowdfunding. Now, what do you understand from this word? It is the practice of funding a project by raising money from a large number of people for a common goal. Organizations reach out to common people for funding. The emergence of platforms that promote crowdfunding is fairly recent to India. These platforms help startups or small businesses to meet their funding requirements. Let's talk about the third source, which is called as angel investment. And who are these angel investors? Angel investors are individuals with surplus cash who have keen interest to invest in upcoming startups. They also offer mentoring or advice alongside the capital. Now let us look at the fourth source, which is venture capital. And what do we understand from this word? These are professionally managed funds which are invested in companies that have huge potential. The venture capitalists provide, number one, expertise, mentorship, and evaluate business from sustainability and scalability point of view. Let's move down to the fifth source, which is business incubators and accelerators. Let us explain this point. In the early stages, business can consider incubator and accelerator program as a funding option. These programs assist hundreds of startup businesses every year. These two are generally used interchangeably. However, incubator is like a parent who nurtures the business, whereas accelerator helps to run or take a giant leap in the business. Incubators and accelerators connect the startup with mentors, investors, and fellow startup using this platform. Let's go down to the last point, which is microfinance and NBFCs. Now, what do you mean by this? Microfinance is basically access to financial services to those who either do not have access to conventional banking services or have not qualified for a bank loan. Similarly, NBFCs, which are also called as non-banking financial corporations, provides banking services without meeting legal requirements of a bank. Now, let's move on to the next slide. And at the end, I would like to thank all the grade 11 students who have patiently or were patiently listening to me. I will again catch you up with a new video on intellectual property rights. Thank you, dear children.